I think we need to understand what it is. And in short, it means only generating a total amount of emissions that can be absorbed. Today, we're a long way away from that balance or net situation, emitting vastly more from every sector than we can possibly absorb at this moment. So once that is understood, then I would suggest the major challenges are the need to understand what your emissions and impacts are today. Depending on the size of your company, this will be a substantial task. I would then suggest that engaging with your supply chain, both upstream, all the items and materials that are flowing to you, and downstream, all the items you are undertaking between you and your customers, logistics and end-of-life handling, to name but two. So challenges-wise, I would consolidate this as creating your own level of understanding of what your impacts are, and you can then look at what you need to do to achieve net zero.
As a target, net zero is a really particularly tough one. So as such, it comes with like myriad challenges and a lot of potential pitfalls. One of the greater challenges that I see is the complexity and the scope of the required changes that we have to make. So the production of carbon emissions is pretty ubiquitous to modern lifestyles. There are very few examples of human activities that do not come with a carbon cost. So one of the key challenges in tackling net zero is, for me at least, in education and awareness. So while there's been some great progress made in some of the more visible areas, we've got to continue to remind ourselves that although we have names for the problem, climate change and global warming can be misleading terms. They suggest that we have one large discrete problem to solve, and as opposed to the reality of the thousands of smaller adjustments that we need to make in order to achieve net zero.
You can achieve carbon neutrality by creating a matched amount of offsets to the emissions you're generating, such as planting trees or other certified schemes. Net zero, however, is defined as a balance point between emissions generated and emissions absorbed. This will require a drastic reduction in emissions generated and investments in renewable energy and other sectors such as agriculture to achieve the balance and therefore net zero. It's worth noting that this should all be achieved by 2050, mid-century or earlier, and we should be halfway there by 2030, and preferably on a 1.5 degree pathway or better.
Simply put, carbon neutrality only requires that you measure your total emissions and then offset those by investing in technologies or projects that remove the equivalent amount of CO2 from the atmosphere. Now that can be done now, but given that there's a limit to the amount of CO2 that can be removed from our atmosphere globally, and although the carbon capture industry is growing rapidly, the technology simply doesn't exist at the scales we need for carbon neutrality to be achieved for everybody, we need the concept of net zero. And that's where this becomes really significant, as it requires the same assessment of total emissions, but comes with the added responsibility of reducing those emissions drastically so that by 2050, a balance can be struck between the total emissions produced and the total emissions captured or removed, but on a global scale.
So having been in the industry for over 35 years now, I've seen shifts in focus and therefore research and development effort. The phase out of CFC refrigerants that were discovered to be contributing to ozone depletion, for example, is a good example. They were a core item in our industry at one point. A problem was found, and through a huge amount of effort, we shifted away from those. And the benefits came with doing that. So energy efficiency has always been part of the discussion over all of those years. However, recently, there's been an increase in focus on the embodied carbon as the use of equipment, what we would call historically the operational phase, is shrinking as a percentage of the whole, putting more emphasis on the whole life cycle of a product. Buildings in all their forms account for 30 to 40% of all emissions, depending on the source that you use for that figure. But they are also huge consumers of raw materials and generate massive amounts of waste. So they have a huge impact regardless of the building type or use or where it is geographically. So for all these reasons, regulation is vast in scope and very deep hitting when it comes to buildings. We need to build better and refurbish existing stock using the right technologies that are widely applicable today, so we can act at the pace needed. And one example of that is heat pumps. There are, of course, other energy intensive sectors of industry, steel making, for example. Heat pumps will not be able to generate the temperatures required for these industries. So this is where hydrogen, for example, would be best placed once obtained in the right way. So you can view energy intensive as in the steel industry way of looking at it, i.e. it needs a lot of high temperature energy at that point. Or you can look at it from a wider impact point of view, as I've mentioned, with just the scope of buildings being a major contributor. So whichever way you look at it, we need to act quickly and decisively. So this is why you're seeing regulation in areas, for example, that can be regulated, such as no new gas boilers by 2028 and no internal combustion cars by 2030.
There's been a real buzz around net zero for the construction industry recently, and this is rightly so, given that the built environment can be contributing anywhere up to about 40% of our emissions in the UK. Whilst I believe this focus on new buildings is really the right way to approach the issue, because we want our new building stock to meet the requirements of the net zero world that much of their lifetimes will be spent in, I want to see the same level of engagement for an arguably bigger and more significant aspect of the built environment, those buildings that already exist. So the UK Green Building Council have estimated that around 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 have already been built. Now, add to this that the UK has some of the oldest housing stock in the world, and it's really easy to see that refurbishment of existing buildings represents a huge opportunity for us to decarbonise.
So regulations such as building standards and section of building codes such as Part L and Part F are updated to reflect what is needed quite regularly, and in fact have just been updated to make sure things are happening in the right way and at the pace required. As for required legislation, we need clear roadmaps as to what the future looks like, what is permissible and not to achieve these goals that we've set ourselves and the whole world is looking at, such as ending fossil fuel boiler use and internal combustion engines, as I've already mentioned. We will also see more local activity, I think. In our recent series of roadshows on net zero, we looked at many different areas of the country and their plans, and some are very ambitious, to say the least, and others less so, but all are on the journey to being net zero. So I think what we will see in the future is more concerted local action, looking at the wider goals and how that can transfer to local nuances, whether it be in a north of the country, a more industrial setting, a more city setting, for example. So local action, I think, is going to grow.
Changes to building codes have already raised the bar for what's required in the built environment, and it's made it harder for us to build less efficient buildings. And while disincentivizing unsustainable practices in this way is certainly part of the solution, one of the key areas I want to see us make a bit more progress in terms of legislation and regulation is in creating incentives for reducing carbon emissions, and in removing some of the incentives that we still have in place to support some high carbon intensity fuels like, say, gas or petrol.
Automotive car industry is seeing a major shift. I think I saw a headline recently that something like 12% now of all new cars being registered in the country are fully electric, and then there'll be another percentage on top of that for plug-in hybrids. However, there's an awful lot more to do. And I honestly feel that buildings and how they are built and renovated can be seen as an industry that's doing well. There is probably the exception of new build homes in that. I would set them out and aside. And in the recent report to Parliament from the Committee on Climate Change, they reserved some criticism for the house builders in that they are not building to the required standards. I think that's shifting now, but we've got a legacy of new build homes that are going to require some actions to make them more efficient and suitable for different technologies such as heat pumps, which we maybe didn't need to do if they'd have been built differently in the first place.
I agree with Martin that we've seen some truly transformational changes take place in transportation. The rise of electric vehicles over the past few years has been truly extraordinary, especially in the personal transportation sector. I'm really excited to see this filter through to have a greater impact on that trickier side of the industry. So, the more commercial transportation and distribution networks. And I think that electric vehicles are a really good metaphor for this transition towards decarbonisation, because the motivation and the focus for that rapid uptake in electric vehicles has been the operational aspect, the amount of carbon emissions required to run the vehicle. But there is, of course, another carbon cost to consider. You've got the embodied emissions, the emissions of manufacturing the electric vehicle in the first place. So, as with all things, we need to strike the right balance here. And that's why I think we need to see some improvements in the legislation in regards to the measurement and the reporting of the embodied carbon aspect of any product, and also a shift in the focus towards a whole life carbon perspective, as this is a more accurate representation of any carbon cost.
We've found ourselves at home being, I think, far more engaged really at what we do and what we choose to buy, that being food, and we're all at this moment in time very much linked to our energy use, of course. But so a lot more engagement, about how our actions and our purchasing decisions can make hopefully some small difference at our scale of one household. But of course, that multiplies out into the many millions of households that we have in this country. So in my years of focusing on sustainability for the company, it can't help but rub off on you in your personal life and those around you. We have two boys who they're both at university, and it's interesting how sustainability has grown and is just a key element. They're both on very different courses, but it's a central tenet to what they're doing. So I find myself, in some pretty in-depth discussions with them, and it's good to have that generation challenging you as well, day to day in your personal life. They keep you on your toes, that's for sure.
There are so many different ways that we can be carbon conscious in our day-to-day lives. It can be really difficult to know where to start. A good example for me is that as a happy carnivore, I find that I've been much more conscious of the amount of meat that I eat, and have reduced my consumption as a result. Though for me, I think this is more a symbolic gesture than it is a significant reduction to my carbon footprint. We should each be prepared to change our own lifestyle to create a more sustainable society. And while I call it symbolic, I think that it's a really important aspect. As individuals, our opportunity to make an impact is limited, and too much of a focus on that individual impact can lead to some really unproductive patterns of thought. Things like, what difference can I make? Or I'm a drop in the ocean. And I think the antidote to this is to apply a sort of mindfulness approach to living sustainably, and to try and consider as much of my day-to-day life through the lens of what is the carbon cost of me doing this. So there are times where this is obvious, the times where I can make a choice to directly impact this, like traveling by train or driving to a location. There are also times where this is much less obvious, and that's also okay. There won't always be a low carbon option available. And in those instances, it's important that as a society, we notice this and reflect on it. And that's the way that we can create better solutions to those problems.
Probably the most impactful change you could possibly make is to reduce your own personal impacts from heating your home. You should certainly not be using any more energy than you need to. So that means making sure your home is adequately insulated, whether that be your lofts or your walls, and stopping drafts. That's probably the most impactful thing that you can do. I mean, the most the most sustainable unit of energy, I suppose, is the one that you don't use. So look to drive down your need to consume energy in the first place. Then, if you are able, you should stop burning fossil fuels for your need for heating. by, for example, using a heat pump. And then after that, I would say there's the car that you choose would be another obvious area to look at.
I think it starts with being conscious of your carbon footprint, and my top tip, certainly both in my personal life and ever more so in my professional life, I've been looking at things through the lens of cost. And I think most of the time we can consider cost as being purely financial, but there are lots of other costs that we face on a day-to-day basis. Sometimes it's time and sometimes it's money. But ever more, I'm thinking of things in terms of a carbon cost. And when somebody says that will cost too much, I have started to say, do you mean the carbon cost or the financial cost? And I think using this as a heuristic for us to keep that, again, mindfulness on our carbon intensity is a really good way for us to look at living a lower carbon lifestyle.
So we have a long-term plan. We're a company that is now just over 100 years old, so we're used to looking very long-term about where we want to be and what we really need to be doing, for the good of society that we're working in. So our current plan is called Environmental Sustainability Vision 2050. And this puts us on a trajectory to being net zero no later than 2050. We've submitted this plan to science-based targets, and we have independent oversight via CDP to make sure that we highlight, where we're doing well, and importantly, the areas that we need to step up on, because we will have different challenges in that regard to others. But this is no static plan. We don't assume that it will just happen. And with 2050 being so far away, it could be easy to fall into that trap of thinking that, others can follow on and make that and achieve that. So it's worth noting that any credible net zero plan, and hopefully ours falls into that category, should look to achieve 50% of their reductions by 2030. Now, that's a far closer time frame, and we can all perhaps get our heads around that a little bit more. So the plans and actions we make today will have a direct impact on that immediate, shorter term target date, and then onwards to 2050. In short, yes, it certainly does. There's a major shift underway away from burning stuff, fossil fuels especially, and we refer to this as the electric economy. Heat and transport need to switch to alternatives that exist today, as they can make the changes needed, importantly, at the pace of change that is required. So this is a huge opportunity for us and many others, and we are looking to rise to this challenge. And we see our role in this to continue to innovate and invest to make this a reality. And by that, I mean new products, enhancements to existing products, expanding our research and development activity, and our manufacturing locally and around the world to rise to that challenge.